the people in HR space is an incredibly giving and compassionate space. You can tell in an interview how innately curious someone is. Building a business is a team sport. It's not individuals doing problem sets in college where you're not supposed to share or cheat. We had an early junior engineer check-in code that broke production in kind of the second year of the company. You know, it was a great hands-on learning moment to fix it. And people will make mistakes and will recover from them. And so by setting that norm of experimentation and mistake making is okay as long as we learn from it, democratizing talent and access to opportunity is tremendous and really exciting.
Hi, Holly. How's it going?
Hey, Chris, I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me on.
Awesome. So I really appreciate you taking the time out. And I think it'd be a really interesting place to start talking about how you got into your people and into the chief people officer role you're in now. Clearly you've got kind of a non-traditional, really interesting background. So can you talk a bit more about that journey and how you got to the role you're in now?
Yes, I'd consider myself an accidental people person. And what I mean by that is coming out of college, I had studied healthcare policy and history of medicine. So I had this interest in healthcare. And I went into management consulting and really had the first chapter of my career working in very business-oriented roles, supporting customers, built fluency in slide decks and Excel models and customer presentations, helping clients figure out how to launch new products and prioritize geographies and things like that. And in that capacity, I had done a lot of people-y things without knowing it. I had invested in new hire onboarding. I'd become one of the first people to kind of formalize a mentorship program. I kind of made sure my new office, which was a satellite office, kind of had a fun spirit and thought about belonging and celebration, but never under the name of a people function or an HR team. And then a little later, I went to business school and I had chosen a path there with a lot of emphasis on leadership development and coaching and building high performance teams, and really found a lot of interest in topics around performance and coaching and cultivating the best in others. And again, didn't realize that that was a job function, and hadn't really known anyone who was in a people or HR space. So my first job out of business school, I picked a person I wanted to learn from. That was a priority I made, a choice I made. Was I'm going to follow a person who represents the path I hope to have for myself, 5 or 10 years ahead of me, who I can really kind of be under their wing and learn and watch. And so I had this kind of chief of staff role to a co-founder and a COO of a growing tech SaaS business. And I witnessed a lot of things happening on the people and culture front, but I wasn't in a position within the company to really shape them. I saw us raise money, grow really quickly, change and pivot directions, ultimately move through some layoffs. And it was that experience as a passenger on that journey saying, I really want to put my sort of hat in the ring and be in the arena and try to do this kind of work. And so themes around culture and performance and belonging had all been core to me from early days. I just never had the professional label of people or HR. And so leaving that company and joining Datavant 4 years ago was my first time jumping into a role that had a true accountability on people and talent and culture activities. And I joined that company 4 years back. We were 17 employees in a San Francisco WeWork, and I was the first person thinking about anything related to compensation, hiring, cultural values, onboarding, any of that, and have had a pretty wild ride over the last 4 years, scaling that into a much more professionalized and scalable path.
And it sounds like you were doing a lot of the parts of the people role, even though you weren't, formally in a role that was labeled people. Was it quite a natural step for you then? Did it feel natural when you were in the role, or was there things that maybe surprised you or things that you were, weren't necessarily ready for?
There's a huge amount of kind of inside baseball in an HR space. There's the vocabulary, there's the best practices, there's the regulatory requirements, there's the compliance obligations that when you come up in a more traditional kind of rise through the ranks in a people or HR space, you probably get exposure to a little bit more exposure to. And by the time you're responsible for a team, you've got a lot of that that you've witnessed or you've kind of apprenticed to. And so stepping in as a accidental people person, there was a lot of that I had to learn. I went to a number of kind of training workshops and we worked with a PEO Trinet, and they offered a lot of like HR administration kind of free trainings. But I think a lot of the softer pieces around values, around how to do onboarding, how should people feel on their first day, on how do we assess candidates, how do we evaluate an executive hire versus a non-executive hire, which is where I think a lot of the meat is in a people function. I think a lot of that comes from kind of gut intuition for me at least, and I hadn't necessarily seen it done great at 3 other companies, and I pulled all that into doing it this time. I think I started a lot from just first principles. I think of myself as a pretty analytical and principle driven thinker of just what ought we do, what could great look like if we had a blank sheet of paper, what would we do and what would we build, and using that to design a lot of our processes, and then checking that with my people network to say, hey, what do you guys do for promotions, for comp review, for announcing executive hires, and for announcing exits and things like that. So a lot of it stems from just intuition and principles, and then building it out from there.
So it sounds like, going into all the gaps that you had, you managed to, I guess, outsource some of that competency and then really skill up on the areas that you were lacking, using different networks and trainings. For people who may be thinking of making a change and coming into this world without a formal background, are there any networks or things in particular that you found incredibly helpful specifically?
Yeah, I think for early stage startups, outsource everything you can. We did all of our benefits and kind of tooling around that front. That wasn't something I wanted to be a subject matter expert in my first few years. So outsourcing, leveraging consultants is a huge piece that you can take advantage of. In terms of networks, I've had a lot of success with the CPO HQ, which is an invite only forum that's run by a company called Noetic, Knoetic. And they sell software to chief people officers that helps visualize dashboards. So they're a tech B2B SaaS company, and in addition to their product, they've built this great community of chief people officers, and there's a really active forum. And so, especially in 2020, when so much changed for HR people leaders, that was an extremely valuable resource to just say, how are you commenting on social justice issues? How are you navigating COVID? How are you welcoming people remotely? And I think there are a number of other people-oriented forums. There's Slack channels, and there's newsletters and all of that. I think find the one that best speaks to you as an individual and where you are in your career journey. And what I found is the people in HR space is an incredibly giving and compassionate space. And so if you ping someone on LinkedIn and say, hey, you've had the career journey I hope for myself, to a people leader, you're way more likely to get someone who says, yeah, sure, let's grab 20 minutes and chat than a lot of other functions, because it is such a compassion and empathy driven part of an organization.
That's awesome. Yeah, I agree with that also. And, being at Datavant, you mentioned you're in a company that raised and grew quickly before. You've more than 10x the team, since you've been in that people role, which is incredible and really fast growth. And it seems like you've been really intentional with how you've built the team, the frameworks you put around it, and you're building the Datavant way and guiding set of cultural principles. Can you talk to me a bit more about your inspiration around that, how you started and the journey that you went on, the building blocks that you put in place at Datavant through that growth?
Yeah, it's a hard question to answer. Let me maybe tell first about just the growth for context, and then the how behind it. So when I joined Datavant in 2018, we were 17, 18 people. We've grown through small tuck-in acquisitions, as well as largely through hiring, scaling teams, through growing. About a year ago in 2021 in the summer, we were, let's say, a 90-person independent organization, and merged with a much, much, much larger services organization that was a private equity-backed kind of nationwide services company called HOAC. And they brought something like 8,000 employees, most of whom were frontline hourly paid associates who work in the medical records departments inside of hospitals. And so we merged the two organizations together. And so that was a massive moment of expanding the population at the company, but it was through a huge kind of M&A moment. So that's a little bit about the growth. Datavant today represents the combination of those two companies, approximately 9,000 employees, the vast majority of whom are frontline hourly associates, and we have about 1,200 salaried professionals in that population today. We are trying hard to bring the Datavant culture, the Datavant approach to compensation and talent, the Datavant approach to being very values driven as a business, how we think about leadership, et cetera, to the combined organization. And we're in a strong position to do that, in part because of the early days and the building blocks that you spoke about, Chris. And so jumping back in time to the founding of Datavant, we had a one-page Google document listing our cultural values before we had customers, before we had revenue, before we'd written the line of code. If you go back into the early archives of the company, the very, very early days had privacy principles. We're a business that works on securely moving healthcare data. And so healthcare privacy is the crux of what we enable. Our principles are on data privacy and our cultural values. Literally, there's like from 2017, one-page Google Docs that are just, a couple of bulleted ideas. But that's how early we started saying, like, what are the principles, the building blocks, the non-negotiables that we would have as a company? And that predated my coming onto the team. I can't take any credit for that. Credit goes to our founder and CEO for all of that. But we've had this strong DNA around who are we and who aren't we, and what do we not flex on? And that has manifested in our cultural values, our approach to hiring, the way we think about a lot of our people practices. And so having that be so clear as a North Star from, literally before we had any lines of code or revenue in the bank, has helped us kind of stay true and consistent and then scale that in a really crystallized way through a lot of change as an organization and a team.
And that's incredible that it was before and you had revenue or had that first line of code. Was that just a approach that the founding team believed was the right way to do things? Was that built from kind of previous experience in founding companies or building teams? Like, what was the motivation behind getting that so early? Because obviously a lot of companies don't do that.
You're right. It did definitely come from being kind of a second time around founding team. Our founder and CEO, Travis, who's still with the company as a significant leader, had ridden the ride of early stage startup scaling all the way through public company previously. And so a lot of things that he was able to apply in the very, very early days of founding Datavant took advantage of things he'd seen and learned and done in a prior business. And so some of that is just the product of the second time you found and scale a company, you're going to do it a little bit more thoughtfully than the first time you do it. Part of probably why, VC likes to invest in second and repeat founders as well. So some of that is just learned the first time, things that worked and didn't work, and applied it a second time. I think also we, from the early days of Datavant, had a strong sense of we wanted to do something in healthcare at a global level that had never been done before. Many, many, many companies from big tech to novel, innovative startups have tried to crack kind of the interoperability challenge and have said, why is it difficult to get my medical records? Why is this still such an unsolved problem? And we knew from the beginning that we were trying to solve something that there was a whole graveyard of companies that had come before us and failed, from household big tech names to many other incumbents. And so we had this sense of exceptionalism. I would say that we had to do things differently. We couldn't just follow the paths that everybody had failed doing before. And so some of that shows up in our product and commercial strategy, but a part of that also shows up in our team and talent and people strategy, that if we were going to do something that many companies had failed to do ahead of us, we had to be really specific about what we were going to do differently and why. And a piece of that has to do with having a really high bar for talent, hiring generalists, hiring for potential, hiring for nimbleness and curiosity, because we were kind of committed to this path of not just doing what all the companies before us had done. And as it relates to our people and talent, there were some very specific prescriptive things that we've kept true in terms of the rigor that we use with hiring and other practices.
Talentful provides flexible recruiting solutions to the world's most ambitious companies. Are you thinking about ways to add flexibility to your talent function? With recent market volatility and hiring set to return to growth mode in the near future, there's never been a better time to choose the right partner to help you scale. Talentful's embedded sourcing, recruiting, coordination, and talent advisory services have been trusted by the world's leading brands. Companies such as Atlassian, Microsoft, Expedia, Pinterest, Waymo, and more. Whether you're hiring across engineering, go-to-market, or G&A, Talentful has got you covered. To find out how Talentful can help you, visit talentful.com. Yeah, and you just touched on it, but one of the things that you feel really passionate about is hiring for potential and giving people those stretch roles where they can grow into them and really test themselves. It's something a lot of people talk about, but fail to execute or struggle to execute. How do you and how have you built the Datavant, the processes to hire for potential, and how do you go about doing that?
I think there's a why and a how embedded in your question, Chris. And I think the why, I think of compounding effect. Right? If you think about investments and you think of compound interest, I think personal growth is very similar. It tends to be exponential. And so when you think of folks in maybe the first half of their career journey, a lot of people will have the capacity to increase their personal skills, 2 or 3x a year. Right? If you take someone who's been in the workforce for 3 or 4 years, you give them another year and you give them the right environment and coaching, they could become, twice as impactful or capable. But most organizations in tech, in professional services, in the investment community, don't have easy paths for people at that first half of their career to do 2 and 3x scaling per year in their capabilities. It's more like 20 or 50% if you're in a learning rich environment. And so when you look at kind of the difference between, call it 50%, expansion of your skills year over year, or 2x expansion of your skills year over year, and you think of it compounding like interest on investments, pretty quickly, a few years in, you can get people with really divergent levels of impact, performance, and capability. And so we've always had a view, especially as an early stage company, that we're not really sure what the future holds. The problems we're solving today and the problems we're solving in 18 months might be really different from one another. So why don't we bring in people who have that capability of 2 or 3 or 5xing their capabilities year over year? And so that's a little bit of the why when you don't know what your problem set is going to be in the future because you're creating the future and you're in a super nimble environment, hiring for people who can grow fast and who want to grow fast is really important. And we call that potential, that sort of will and skill to grow. In terms of how, it's tricky. We do a lot of interviewer shadowing and interviewer training in the company today. I think learning is a really critical dimension to assess for, learning or curiosity. One of the most important things I assess for personally is curiosity. So I'll ask questions around, tell me something you've learned in the last few years. It could be personal or professional. It could be I picked up woodworking during COVID, or it could be I learned a new code base in my last job. But the how is so much more important than the what. Are you a hands-on learner? Do you want to read a lot of blogs? Do you want to go to events and learn from practitioners? Do you want to try and hit every obstacle that you encounter and ask experts for help? But I push a lot on how people learn. I think also you can tell in an interview how innately curious someone is by spending a lot of time on their questions. And so I typically, in a typical 30-minute interview, like first time I'm meeting someone as an interviewer, we'll try to have at least like 8 to 12 minutes of airtime that is their questions. And that's good for selling a candidate, of course, but it also tells you, did they prep questions in advance and how good are those questions? And so that curiosity is something you can kind of assess in terms of the questions they bring to you as the interviewer. And then I like to push on resilience and grit as maybe the last piece. And tell me a story. Tell me about a time that you struggled, or when have you gotten really hard feedback and bounced back from it? Various questions that kind of put the candidate in a place of, this thing I did was hard. This thing I did sucked. This thing I did was really trying. How did I move through it? Right? Did I react with that teachable spirit and I mined the experience for lessons learned and I got up and I got better? Or did I get kind of beaten down and burned out and disappointed? So I think something around grit and resilience, along with teaching, with learning and curiosity, are kind of the really key skills to assess for as you're managing a person and certainly as you're evaluating them as a candidate.
And on the learning side, you mentioned some of the ways people might learn, events or reading or asking experts or just trying and failing and trying again. For Datavant, is there one of those that you look for? Is it more just the examples and the way that the people have learned stuff and the historical examples more so? Or do you prefer one of those?
I don't think there's any one that's right or one that's wrong. I do think there's certain styles that probably fit better with different managers and different organizations at different moments in time. And so if you, as a learner, take the approach of, I want to do it myself, right? I see this a lot with early career, maybe even college senior software engineers. And I say, how do you say, here's a scenario, you've gotten a challenge from your manager, you're not really sure how to solve it, you don't know where to start. What do you do? How long do you work on your own alone? When do you start to post in the team Slack for guidance? When do you ask your manager for help? And I think there's a lot of different models that can work. But if someone says, I don't want to bother my team of managers, I'm going to do a lot of reading, I'm going to take an academic approach to it, I'm going to test and fail, I'm going to sort of trial and error, I'll push hard on, when do you know that you're wasting your time? Like when do you realize, hey, I should ask my team for help, right? Like building a business is a team sport. It's not individuals doing problem sets in college where you're not supposed to share or cheat. And so I want to kind of push on, do you have this internal signal, this internal moment that says, let me ask some other people? On the flip side, if someone says, hey, I learned best as being an apprentice, I want to watch someone do it. And it's sort of a, see one, do one, teach one kind of a model. Like I want to be shown, I want to have some hands-on tutorial. That can work fine too. Especially in kind of, a lot of different forums. If you do pair programming as an engineering team, or you do a sales model where you have kind of junior salespeople supporting pitches and witnessing a more tenured person doing it. But then you want to push on, do they work individually enough before they ask for help? If they like to be in that apprentice model and we don't have a super formalized mentorship, hands-on shadow program, will they have enough, will the candidate have enough capability and will to, do some research on their own, right? You want people to work independently. You want people to work autonomously before they tap on their colleagues or their manager for help. And so to your question of sort of, is one strategy of learning better than the other? The answer is no, but I like to vet kind of the worst case scenario for each type of learning style to make sure that someone's not going to spend a week, alone working on a coding problem when maybe half a day would have been fine. And then they could have asked for help on Monday afternoon instead of waiting till Friday afternoon.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And I think that it's interesting because, Datavant, I guess in the earlier days, a lot of companies, I think, struggle with this high potential because maybe they don't have the framework of seniority or the frameworks to allow these people to be set up for success once they join. So they might have the potential, but they will never achieve that potential because there isn't the support mechanism in place because they don't have enough people or managers or whatever else. How did you overcome that challenge and provide, once these people with great potential are in, letting them flourish and giving them the support and the learning opportunity, whilst also simultaneously growing quickly? I mean, how did you manage that?
I think you have to keep the right balance of experienced and not yet experienced folks with high potential. So I don't want to recommend that, if you're hiring a CFO as a Series B startup, you should get somebody who was good at numbers in college and has never had a financial experience before. Like that's not the right model. So I think first there's a knowledge of which types of roles really benefit from potential as the primary capability and which benefit from specialization or expertise. If you're hiring general counsel, I'd recommend getting someone who went to law school and maybe has been in a company doing counsel work before. So it's not a one size fits all roles, but there's this ability to diagnose. And I think for the typical company of 100 people, let's say, tech company and Series A or B or C, way more roles than typical people think, than conventional wisdom would suggest, can be high impact if they're hired for potential. But certainly not 100 of 100 roles should be only governed by potential. And then I think, there's an aspect of having the resources built into the company. Do you have an emphasis on coaching and feedback? Do you state manager expectations include giving written feedback, X times a year? Do you state that it's an expectation of a manager that you do one-on-ones every week, and at least a few minutes of that involves coaching a team member through a problem? So one of our other early principles-based documents that I talked about was, what are the expectations of a leader of this company? And we wrote out kind of 5 categories, and there were 16 sort of tenets that said, we believe in feedback and culture, feedback and coaching as really critical ingredients to this environment. So if you have high potential team members that you bring in, like you said, Chris, but you don't pair that with an environment that facilitates learning, that is okay with making mistakes, then you'll never have people kind of unlock that potential. And so we tried to be clear that it's an expectation we have for every leader to give coaching, to make it okay to make mistakes. We had an early junior engineer check-in code that broke production in kind of the second year of the company. And, we joke about that. Everyone knows who it was and that moment. And we tried to make that a lore because we celebrate that. That person didn't get in trouble. There was no penalty for it. It was a great hands-on learning moment to fix it. And ultimately, we tell stories like that because it shows you do work that matters. Like, we take off the guardrails, we trust you, and people will make mistakes and will recover from them. And so by setting that norm of experimentation and mistake making is okay as long as we learn from it in appropriate ways, and then setting expectations for managers and leaders to invest in coaching and feedback, we hope to kind of use those things as fertilizer for the potential so it can really grow and be unlocked.
And so interesting. And I mean, it seems like when you talk about it, it seems like, oh yeah, that makes total sense. But it's so hard to actually get right and actually execute on. I guess, you mentioned that you organically grew relatively quickly, but then you had this really accelerated population growth with the acquisition. How do you now, I guess, balance keeping these principles and keeping your core value set and these things that are really important to you? I guess the first bit is just with growing quickly in general and that demand you have from stakeholders in the business in such a competitive market anyway. I know the people that you hire are really, really highly skilled for the most part and very desirable in the market. And then also blending that with an incoming culture that you're joining that might not share the same, exactly the same views. So I guess 2-part question there.
Yeah, I'm chuckling because we're in it. I don't know that we've been through the journey to get to the other side to say what success looks like, but just being in the messy middle on that transition of 2 cultures coming together, I can share a few thoughts. But I think the first part of your question was around just scaling, kind of separate from merger integration type work. What we've found success has been helpful for us and may translate to other companies and may not, is just being really crystallized in who we are and who we aren't. And so we've not really flexed on our cultural values. We've not really flexed on our hiring processes. And I think that's been helpful because it's just built a set of purity of thought, a clear North Star, a rallying vision. But ultimately, as we've grown, we've embraced more roles where experience and expertise and specialization are worth it. So if you said of the first 50 people we hired, what % were high potential generalists? And if you looked at a company at 300 people and you said the last 50 people we've hired, what is that ratio? I don't have the numbers top of mind, but I would say the first 50 versus number 250 to 300, you skew, right? You decrease the percentage of roles that are truly high potential generalist. Now, I think it's still a lot and maybe even a majority of roles, but I think as a company scales its headcount, you do need more specialization and expertise. And so some of it's dependent on just size and stage of maturity. Certain functions need it more than others. In our work dealing with healthcare data and encryption and security on health data, we needed to have some pretty sophisticated privacy and security expertise in-house quickly. So one of our earliest hires was a chief privacy officer. And we've kind of put a huge investment in privacy, compliance, and security given the nature of our business. For a direct-to-consumer product, that may not be as critical. But I think there's a piece where specialization expertise, depending on your business and or functions at your business, is more important to shift from generalists to specialists faster. So that's just on the kind of the growth story. I think the second part of your question, Chris, was around the integrating organizations that have some different kind of starting points on these topics. It's hard and it's exciting, and it's the kind of the challenge of our team at this moment in time. And I'm really energized by the reward. But ultimately, when you have an organization that has aimed for top talent, right? One of the top metrics I like to track in our Pulse survey is the percentage of employees who strongly agree with a statement that's something like, the colleagues I work with are the most competent and talented colleagues I've ever worked with. Like that's one of our Pulse survey questions. That number should be high, and number should stay high. When that number dips, we know we're doing something wrong. And so you take an organization where that has been the DNA, and then you pair it with an organization where that has not yet been the core DNA. You have to navigate change, where we're asking people to hire differently. We're asking people to focus on talent more than cost. Like, yes, a highly talented person probably will cost more than the person you're able to get if you're only able to pay at a 30th percentile. And so we've seen that kind of talent and compensation, or talent and rewards, have been really tightly coupled in some of the change management that we're doing on this topic. When then it starts to say, well, my budget is X. How do I get 3 people like that in my budget if my budget is X? And then we start to talk about, are there ways to get the same skill set in a part-time or an outsourced or a consultant model? Is there a way to do rebudgeting? Is there a way to, thin down your team in other places to free up more budget so that you can make a strategic investment in talent here? But we've uncovered kind of this budget cost optimization, compensation set of issues that are so tightly coupled with this top talent, rigorous hiring piece of it. And we're still testing out the right ways to make that transition together.
Yeah, it's interesting how different people view that problem, because I've definitely worked with customers and businesses in the past that by saving budget, they want to spread someone over multiple roles to save money. But the way you're talking about things is more of a kind of value multiple. So, having really highly competent people that are working together, they can 10x the value of a company that, so that's I guess a more positive and exciting way of looking at things, which is great. It's really interesting hearing you speak, and I guess the more experience I have, building my own business and also listening to experts like yourself talk, I think companies somehow give framework and structure. They think of it in a negative way of kind of slowing companies down or creating bureaucracy and politics. But it seems like a lot of companies would benefit from having foundational, process and structure and, I guess, expectations from a very, very early stage, because it will, again, multiply the chance of you being able to scale successfully. Or if, I was to start a business that had ambitions to grow quickly, what are the kind of top 2 things you would recommend kind of putting in place from a people perspective? Are there things that really would get that return that you feel really passionately about?
I love the question. I would call out that there's a huge distinction between starting fresh when you're founding a company, or when I joined with 17 total employees, and you have that open blank page to craft your story. And when you join an existing organization and you need to maintain a number of programs and a number of initiatives, and making changes comes at a cost. I think those are two really different environments, and it's just worth noting for listeners, or if you're in that founding entrepreneurial phase, or if you're in that scaling and sustaining phase. But if you're in that founding phase, to your question, I think you have to be authentic to the founding team, right? And so what I mean by that is you've heard me talk about principles, you've heard me talk about Google Docs that were documented. Our founding team was very cerebral, very academic, very kind of logic driven. And so that led to a tendency to write things down, a tendency to debate things till they got really refined and honed, and a tendency to think from first principles, what ought to be true, rather than what's common in the market or what are best practices. And I think if you had a team that wasn't, I think the core infrastructure to your question of kind of top two things to build early stage in a people team, I think has to be authentic to who those leaders are. Um, I would much rather write than talk personally, but if you find someone who's extremely charismatic and loves the spotlight and doesn't love to have to pen their thoughts on paper, like what they produce or provide may look different. So I think the authenticity to the leading team is really, really key. But pulling on my own experience, I think some sort of founding principles on the organization you want to be. Do you want to be an employer of choice for top talent? That's the right play for some teams. It's not the right play for others. Do you want to bring an ideology or a voice as it relates to, social justice or ESG themes? That's right for some organizations and not for others, but being clear on that from the beginning. I'm just taking examples of what you could be clear on, but I think a set of the things that need to be in our North Star from day one. What are those? We had kind of an intolerance of brilliant jerks, the concept of someone who's extremely capable, but leaves bodies in their wake and it has a lot of friction to work with and nobody wants to be on their team. We said from day one, no, like that's why nice is one of our core attributes that we look for when we say we look for smart, nice, and get things done. And so we knew from the beginning, kind of no brilliant jerks. That was right for us. It's not right for all organizations. And there's many successful, brilliant jerks and companies who benefited from them. So I think I would just say commit to what you won't negotiate on, what you won't flex on, and ideally put it in some sort of paper artifact so you can share it with people as you grow. And I think there some objectivity in your hiring process. If you just hire people who are your friends from college, like you're going to spiral into a pretty narrow set of population with a lack of diversity of thought and perspective. And so I think some best practices are best for a reason on objective and criteria-based structured interviewing.
Yeah. I think having that clarity over who you are, who you want to be, and those non-negotiables, I think just makes everything much easier. And even just looking at your business I run, being more clear about that earlier on would save a lot of headaches. So I'm sure there's lots of people that empathize with what you're saying and wish they'd done that earlier. And so, final question, Holly. What are you most excited about when it comes to the future of people and talent acquisition?
I think they're both hot topics today, but I think remote or hybrid work and compensation are probably the two themes I find myself reading about online in various forums and articles. And I think remote is here to stay. There's lots and lots of debate. That's not what you asked me to come on the show and talk about, but I think a large portion of our knowledge worker economy is doable anywhere that you have an internet connection. And whether that's your family kitchen and dining room table or an RV in the desert, I think that allows an incredible degree of hiring the best talent wherever it sits, building diverse teams, building teams that give more flexibility to employees. And I think that is here to stay. It may not be the right fit for every team, but I think that as we think about people and talent acquisition, being able to hire nationally instead of cities where you have offices, being able to hire nationally or globally instead of where you have certain tax codes that you've established in certain states or certain municipalities. So I think remote and what that unlocks for democratizing talent and access to opportunity is tremendous and really exciting. And I think then sparked in part by remote and in part by Great Resignation and economic shifts, I think compensation is kind of having a moment. I was looking at a newsletter this morning that basically said the top topic for 2022 for people leaders was compensation. You've got Colorado and New York passing legislation around pay transparency. You've got kind of this growing question of equal pay for equal work. Do you localize pay by geography? And if you truly are remote, how is that fair? And all of that. And so I think kind of compensation and reward is having this kind of hot moment in the spotlight where I think we'll see some very different practices in the years ahead. You see some companies pioneering now today, but I think kind of compensation and pay equity and pay transparency are pretty impressive, exciting themes to follow for the next few years.
Yeah, absolutely. And then on the opposite side of that, you've got those companies that are maybe using this friction in the market right now to try and get people back. So I'm with you. I think the people who focus on providing a great platform for people to be effective wherever they are going to win. But I think you might have set us up for our next podcast in the future, Holly, where you could come in and talk about remote work and compensation philosophy. But it's been really great having you. I've really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you very much. And hopefully we can get that podcast in the future.
Absolutely. Chris, thanks so much for the time and really appreciated the conversation.